2018 Patriots were the worst team of the dynasty to still win the Super Bowl. Tom Brady was 41 years old and Gronk's body was falling apart. The front office had stripped the roster down over the offseason, so it looked like things were lining up to say the dynasty was officially over. They had to grind out every single yard and survive mistakes that should have ended their season, but when the game was on the line, they found a way to pull through and eked out one more championship before it all ended. To understand the 2018 season in its full context, you have to look at the wreckage that they left behind from the years past. Between 2001 and 2016, they made 7 Super Bowls and walked away with 5 rings. They started the run in 2001 by winning 3 titles in 4 years with a defense that suffocated everyone. Then they spent the next decade building Brady-led offenses that broke every record in the book. No other franchise in the salary cap era has ever sustained that kind of dominance because most dynasties only last 3 or 4 years before the roster turns over and the window slams shut. New England was the outlier that just kept finding ways to win. The absolute peak of that era happened in the 2016 Super Bowl against Atlanta. Brady came back from a 4-game suspension to start the year, and the offense moved with a rhythm we hadn't seen since '07. When the Falcons built that infamous 28-3 lead in the third quarter, every fan watching at home assumed that the game was over. But Tom Brady ended up throwing 466 yards to lead the greatest comeback in the history of the sport. It felt like the entire identity of the dynasty was compressed into one night of impossible circumstances and total belief in the outcome. That was the image that everybody had carried into 2017, that Brady and Belichick just couldn't lose, and that's what made the ending of the 2017 season so hurtful. Going into 2017 and on paper, the team looked even better. Brady won league MVP while Gronk earned first team All-Pro honors after putting up 1,000 yards and 8 touchdowns in 14 games. They finished the regular season 13-3, looking as loaded as it has been in a decade. But they still lost the Super Bowl to Philadelphia 41-33. Nick Foles somehow outplayed Brady on the biggest stage, and the Philly special on 4th down became an instant part of NFL legend. And that failure had a price. Within months, the roster that could have won it all was being stripped for parts. Patricia out to Detroit, Solder, Butler, Lewis all left in free agency. Josh McDaniels nearly left for Indianapolis before backing out in one of the most chaotic front office moments in league history. And Brandon Cooks, their only legitimate deep threat, was traded to the Rams. One offseason and 5 foundational pieces are now gone. Heading into 2018, the question wasn't if they could be as good as the year before, but whether they could even seriously compete. Week 1 looked fine on the surface. Brady threw for 277 yards and 3 touchdowns as they walked down the Texans, and it looked like all the talk that had happened over the offseason was just going to be that. Just noise. And then the next week against Jacksonville happened. The Jags defense had come within 1 quarter of ending the dynasty the previous January in the AFC Championship game, and they had the personnel to take away those underneath routes that Brady loved so much. They hit him before he could get comfortable, which made the lack of depth at the skill positions a real problem very fast. Jacksonville won 31-20, and the game wasn't even as close as the score looked during the middle quarters. Brady finished with 234 yards while the ground game went nowhere. Detroit the following week was even worse. Tom threw for 133 yards. The Lions basically dared New England to beat them with their receivers. They took away every route that required a guy to win in space, and the offense simply had no answer. The final score was 26-10, and there were stretches of that game where the gap between what the Patriots used to be and what they actually were in 2018 looked impossible to close. With the losses to the Jags and Detroit, it marked the first back-to-back double-digit losses the Patriots had suffered since 2002. Now, the media had exactly what they were waiting for. What made it even worse was the context of who was missing. Julian Edelman was still serving the last 2 games of a 4-game suspension, so Brady's most reliable target in pressure situations was stuck watching at home. Gronk was on the field, but he clearly wasn't himself. He hadn't scored a touchdown in those first 3 weeks and was averaging under 30 yards per game, which for a guy like him is almost unrecognizable. The question now became whether everybody was just too old to win, and nobody had a confident answer for that yet. Edelman came back in week 5 against Indianapolis, and the result on the field was immediate. Brady went 34 of 44 for 344 yards, and the offense finally looked like it had a pulse again. It's not that Julian Edelman is a transcendent talent who burns people deep, but Tom trusts him completely in every situation, and that trust frees up every other option on the field. Defenses that have been sitting on intermediate routes and daring New England to beat them vertically suddenly had a problem they couldn't ignore. Josh Gordon had arrived via trade from Cleveland on September 17th, giving Brady a 6'3" deep threat for the first time all season. When you put Gordon on one side and Edelman in the slot, the math changes for every secondary in the league. But the game that really defined what this season was going to be happened in week 6 against Kansas City. Both teams came in with something to prove. The Chiefs had Patrick Mahomes running an offense that looked like the future of the NFL, and the league was starting to realize they were watching something generational happen in real time. The Patriots were the team that everyone had just buried 2 weeks earlier, which set up a game that went completely sideways in the best way possible. Brady threw for 340 yards while Mahomes threw for 352. They combined for 814 total yards and 83 points, and the Patriots came out on top 43-40. The offense scored on 5 possessions in a row at one stretch, and Sony Michel ran for 106 yards and 2 touchdowns. The rookie was giving them a physical element in the run game they hadn't seen in years, acting more like a brute force hammer than the receiving backs they usually use. When Kansas City made it a shootout, Brady just kept making throws with that methodical, cool-headed approach he's shown for 18 years. They won 6 straight games from week 4 through week 9, beating the Bears, Bills, Chiefs, and Packers along the way. The offense was scoring over 30 points a game during that stretch, yet the old and slow conversation never fully went away. Even as the wins stacked up, the coverage kept circling back to whether they could actually sustain this. People wondered if a soft stretch of the schedule was masking real problems, or what would happen when they faced a defense built specifically to stop Brady. Gronk's situation also became more complicated during this run. He was missing more practices and playing fewer snaps. He was still capable of taking over a game when he was right, but when he would actually be healthy was becoming harder to answer every single week. They were 7-2 and winning, but the eye test told many people not to believe in them just yet. But the fall didn't happen at once, it happened in pieces. Week 10 in Tennessee was the first real sign that the 7-2 record was hiding some serious flaws. The Titans decided to run the ball directly at the New England front 7, and they dared Brady to beat him in the cold with a limited group of weapons. He just couldn't get it done that day. Tom went 21 of 41 for 254 yards and no TDs, and the offense watched 2 drives stall out in Tennessee territory while the game was still within reach. When the final whistle blew at 34-10, the second half looked like a team that completely ran out of answers. That loss snapped a 6-game winning streak and sent the questions about this roster flooding back in. Then we have the Miami game, and this one is genuinely painful to look back on. The Patriots were leading 33-28 with only 14 seconds left on the clock. They had survived a pretty ugly performance where Brady threw for 358 yards and 3 TDs despite the mess around him. And all they needed was for the defense to make one clean tackle on a desperation lateral. Instead, the Dolphins turned a simple pass into a 69-yard touchdown when Kenyon Drake caught a pitch and ran untouched into the end zone, running right around Gronk. Multiple New England defenders stood there flat-footed and watched it happen, and that 34-33 loss basically killed any chance of getting the top seed in the AFC. This meant if they actually made the conference championship, they would have to play it on the road. The Week 15 loss at Pittsburgh finished the job for good. The final was 17-10. The offense only managed 272 total yards, and Brady threw an interception deep in Steelers territory that killed their best scoring drive at the second half. New England desperately needed that win to stay in the hunt for the first seed, but with that loss, they turned to 9-5 and locked themselves into the 2 seed, and then Josh Gordon was gone. On December 20th, the NFL suspended him indefinitely for violating the substance abuse policy. The Patriots finished the year 11-5, which was the first time they had 5 losses since 2009. Gronk finished the regular season with 682 yards and 3 touchdowns in 13 games, but reports later showed he was dealing with Achilles tendonitis and a bulging disc in his back for most of the second half of the season. At this point in time, it was official. They were old, they were slow, and they were definitely banged up. However, they were the 2 seed, and they knew they'd likely have to win a road game just to see the Super Bowl. But January changed the entire conversation for the Patriots. The Chargers came into Foxborough as a 5 seed with a 12-4 record, and Phillip Rivers was playing some of the best football of his long career. But Brady went 34-44 for 343 yards and a touchdown, which was a controlled and efficient performance that showed he was still in command the entire game. Julian Edelman had 9 catches for 151 yards and set the tone on the very first drive by finding the soft spots in the Charger zone to convert tough third downs. But the player who really carried the afternoon was Sony Michel. He ran for 129 yards and 3 touchdowns on 24 carries behind an offensive line that physically dominated the Chargers front 7 for 60 minutes. The 41-28 final score actually looked a lot closer than the game actually felt when it was happening. However, that was the easy part of the bracket. The AFC Championship game would be much tougher in 19-degree weather with 77,000 fans at Arrowhead cheering on the Kansas City Chiefs. It was a rematch of the Week 6 shootout, and we weren't sure if the Patriots were actually going to win this one. But this time around, Belichick showed up with a game plan that looked nothing like what we saw back in October. The first half wasn't a shootout at all, it was domination. The Patriots took the opening drive 80 yards on 15 plays, shoot up over 8 minutes of clock, and finish it off with a Sony Michel touchdown run. That slow pace set the tone for the rest of the half. The front four had been called the weakest unit of the Belichick era all year, but they held Mahomes and the Chiefs to just 32 yards on 16 plays in the first half. Pat was constantly pressured and flushed out of the pocket, which denied him the clean looks he needed to find his playmakers. New England went into the locker room up 14-0, and it looked like the game might be over. However, it wasn't over, because it never is when you're playing Patrick Mahomes. The fourth quarter alone turned into absolute chaos as Kansas City put up 24 points in that final frame. Mahomes threw 3 touchdown passes. The Chiefs actually took the lead twice, but Brady had an answer both times. The second response was a 65-yard drive with only a minute and 24 seconds left that ended with a Rex Burkhead touchdown run. Brady had hit 3 consecutive completions under massive pressure with the season on the line, and he made it look routine, because that's just what he does. The D Ford offsides penalty is still the most talked about play of that postseason because it wiped out what should have been a game-sealing interception. Travarius Ward picked off Brady and the stadium went crazy, but then the flag came out and changed everything. Kansas City managed to force overtime with a field goal, but the Patriots won the coin toss and never looked back. They drove 75 yards in 13 plays, converted 3 huge third downs, and Burkhead scored again from 2 yards out to win it 37-31. On the field after the win, a microphone caught Brady joking about being too old and being too slow, saying that the team had no skill players and no defense left. But they were headed to their 3rd straight Super Bowl to face the Rams, which was the same team Brady beat to start the whole dynasty 18 years earlier. The Rams walked into the Super Bowl with a 13-3 record, and Sean McVay had spent 2 seasons turning Jared Goff from a reclamation project into a high-level starter, and his offensive scheme was the talk of the entire league. Between the constant motion and the pre-snap shifts, defensive coordinators were losing sleep just trying to figure out how to slow down the Rams' offense that season. Todd Gurley had racked up 21 touchdowns during the regular season, while Aaron Donald was living in opposing backfields and finished the year with over 20 sacks. Vegas set the over-under at 56 points because everyone expected a massive shootout, which made sense given how both teams had played all year. The thing is, nobody told the Patriots defense they were supposed to give up points that day. The Rams managed only 57 total yards in the entire first half, and their first 7 drives all ended in punts. Goff had looked comfortable against NFC teams all season, but he spent the first 30 minutes looking like he'd never seen a football game before. After that game, McVay was honest and admitted he got outcoached. It showed exactly what Bill Belichick and Brian Flores had put together for that specific matchup. The game was tied 3-3 heading into the fourth quarter, making it the first Super Bowl ever where nobody scored a touchdown through 3 periods. These two offenses combined averaged over 60 points a game this regular season, but this late into the game, they still only had 3 points each. But then Gronk finally made a play. New England was backed up at their own 31-yard line with 7 minutes left, and Tom Brady knew he needed a touchdown to put this thing away. He found Gronk for 18 yards early in the drive to get things moving. Then, on the biggest play of the night, Rob Gronkowski ran a route against 2 defenders and beat them both to haul in a 29-yard pass at the 2-yard line. Sony Michel punched it in from 2 yards out just a couple plays later. That was his 6th rushing touchdown in the postseason, which set a new NFL record for a rookie. Stephon Gilmore made sure the Rams didn't come back. Goff tried to move the ball down the field with 4 minutes left and threw a pass toward the end zone, but Gilmore read the play the whole way and picked it off at the 2-yard line. A late field goal from Steven Gostkowski puts the lead to 10, and that was the end of the road for the Rams. Tom had finished the night 21-35 for 262 yards and a pick, so it wasn't his best game, and he'd be the first person to tell you that. However, Julian Edelman was absolutely incredible. He caught 10 passes for 141 yards, and 8 of those catches moved the chains for a first down. Julian won Super Bowl MVP because he was the only guy who could consistently keep drives alive. This win made Brady the first player in NFL history to earn 6 Super Bowl rings. At 41 years old, he also became the oldest quarterback to ever win the big one. Gronk ended up retiring 2 months later. Brady headed to Tampa after the 2019 season, and Belichick stayed until 2023. That night in Atlanta was the final time the trio stood together on the biggest stage in sports. It wasn't a high-scoring explosion like people wanted to see, but instead, it was a masterclass and a dynasty showing up one last time. If you look at this roster on paper, the 2018 group was probably the weakest of the entire dynasty. But the eye test tells a different story about their toughness. This core had been to the Super Bowl 5 times in 7 years, and they had seen everything the game could throw at them. They won in overtime against the Falcons, and they lost in a heartbreaker to the Eagles. They dealt with players leaving, suspensions, and crazy plays like the D Ford penalty, but they still found a way to win when the lights were the brightest. When the moment arrived, they were simply more prepared and less afraid than anyone else. So there you have it. Watch this next video if you haven't already, and subscribe if you're new. Thanks for watching.